To outsiders, they seem almost identical. But DNA tells a different story. Recent groundbreaking genetic studies have revealed something extraordinary. Swedes and Danes are genetically more different from each other than you might expect. Despite their proximity and shared Viking heritage, these two populations have distinct genetic profiles that reflect very different histories. Danes carry a genetic component that clusters with modern British populations in genetic studies, representing shared ancient ancestry from Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and Bronze Age migrations, not recent British immigration. Modern Danes are one of Europe's most genetically homogeneous populations, while Sweden shows striking regional diversity, with northern Swedes being genetically closer to Finns than to southern Swedes. The I1 haplogroup, the Nordic genetic marker, is found in 35 to 40% of Swedish men, but varies dramatically across Denmark. And here's something that will shock you. Danes and southern Swedes are actually genetically closer to northern Germans than northern Swedes are to southern Swedes. How did two neighbouring countries develop such different genetic landscapes? The answer involves Bronze Age migrations, Viking Age expansions, medieval wars, and surprising patterns of isolation that persisted for over 1,000 years. Today, we're decoding the genetic divide that splits Scandinavia's heartland. This is Swedish DNA versus Danish DNA. Before we explore what makes them different, we need to understand what Swedes and Danes share. The Bronze Age beginning. Both modern Swedish and Danish populations trace their primary ancestry back to the same Bronze Age event, the corded ware culture expansion around 2900 BCE. As we covered in the Danish DNA documentary, this migration brought people with Yamnaya steppe ancestry from the Pontic-Caspian region into Scandinavia. This created the genetic foundation that still defines both nations today. According to the Wikipedia Nordic DNA project, ancient DNA studies have showed that modern Scandinavians are remarkably similar to the corded ware people of the late Copper Age and early Bronze Age. This Bronze Age population brought Y-DNA, haplogroup R1A and I1, high levels of lactose tolerance, genes for light skin and varied eye colours, and Indo-European languages that evolved into Swedish and Danish. So why do they differ today if they share this foundation? During the Viking Age, from 793 to 1066 AD, both Sweden and Denmark were major powers, but they expanded in different directions. Danish Vikings primarily raided and settled westward, England, Ireland, Normandy. The 2020 Viking DNA study by Margarian and colleagues in Nature found evidence for a major influx of Danish ancestry into England during this period. Swedish Vikings, meanwhile, travelled east along Russian rivers, establishing the Varangian Rus and trading routes to Constantinople and the Islamic world. This directional difference in expansion would have lasting genetic consequences, as Vikings brought back wives and slaves from their travels. The Y-DNA haplogroup, I1, is often called the Nordic or Viking marker because it reaches its highest frequencies in Scandinavia. According to the Swedish DNA project, I1 originated in northern Europe, probably in Denmark, and about 35 to 40% of Swedish males carry I1 or its subclades. This shared genetic marker confirms the common Bronze Age and Viking heritage. But as we'll see, even I1 distribution varies significantly between and within these countries. The Scandinavian language family, Swedish and Danish, both descend from Old Norse, the Viking Age language. They remain mutually intelligible to this day, though with significant pronunciation differences that often make verbal communication challenging. This linguistic similarity might suggest genetic similarity, but DNA tells a more complex story. Let's start with Denmark, since we already have comprehensive data from the 2016 study, the Danish homogeneity. The landmark 2016 study, Nationwide Genomic Study in Denmark, reveals remarkable population homogeneity by Athanasiadis and colleagues in the journal Genetics analysed Danish genomes and made a stunning discovery. Danish individuals showed remarkable genetic uniformity across all regions. The study used principal component analysis, comparing Danish samples to other European populations, and found Danes clustered very tightly together, showing minimal regional variation. The ancient ancestry components. Here's where it gets interesting. The study found that when comparing Danish genomes to reference populations, Danish Ancestry shows these clustering patterns. Swedish-like component 27.45 to 30.20%, Norwegian-like component 14.24 to 18.76%, British-like component 40.37 to 48.16%, peaking in South Jutland, German-like component only 3.04 to 6.78%. But wait! Before you think Danes are half British, let me explain what this actually means. These percentages don't mean Danes are British. They mean that when geneticists compare Danish DNA to modern reference populations, Danish genomes cluster more with British samples than with Swedish or Norwegian samples in certain analyses. Why? Because both Danes and Brits inherited similar proportions of ancient ancestry from Mesolithic Western hunter-gatherers who lived across Atlantic Europe, Bronze Age populations who spread across Western Europe, and Neolithic farmers who came from the south. The researchers are using modern British populations as a reference point for this ancient shared ancestry, not claiming recent British migration to Denmark. Think of it like this. If your DNA test says you have Italian ancestry, it doesn't mean your grandparents were from Italy. It means you share genetic patterns with modern Italians because of shared ancient ancestry. Same principle here. The study's key finding was actually about Denmark's geographic position. This difference could be explained by the reduced landscape connectivity between Norway and Denmark, affecting gene flow patterns. Denmark, jutting out into the North Sea and Baltic, received ancient migrations from multiple directions, from the Atlantic coast, from Central Europe, and from Scandinavia. This created a unique mixture that happens to cluster more with British samples in genetic studies than with other Scandinavian samples. The real takeaway: what this data actually shows, Danes cluster genetically between continental/Atlantic Europeans and other Scandinavians. Denmark was a genetic crossroads in prehistory. Ancient migration patterns, not modern ones, created this signature. Danes are not half British. They're Danish with complex ancient ancestry. Despite Denmark sharing a land border with Germany and having historically fluid borders, the genetic influence is surprisingly small, only 3 to 7%. The 2013 study by Rumbauer and colleagues titled Contemporary Paternal Genetic Landscape of Polish and German Populations noted similar findings: sharp genetic discontinuity along political borders that results from cultural boundaries maintaining genetic distinctiveness. Y DNA in Denmark. While comprehensive modern Danish Y DNA frequencies aren't published in the same detail as Swedish data, studies suggest one Nordic marker at high frequency, approximately 35 to 40%. R1b, Western European at 20 to 25%. R1, a Eastern European/Slavic at 15 to 20%. I2A at 10 to 15%. The 2024 Allentoft study showed that Bronze Age and Iron Age Denmark had different haplogroup frequencies, with I1 increasing and R1 decreasing over time. Now let's examine Sweden, and this is where things get really interesting. Sweden is not genetically homogeneous. Unlike Denmark's remarkable uniformity, Sweden shows striking regional diversity. The 2011 study The Genetic Structure of the Swedish Population by Humphreys and colleagues in PLOS1 analysed 5,174 Swedes with extensive geographical coverage. Their findings were dramatic. We observed strong differences between the far northern counties and the remaining counties. The study concluded, the population of Sweden's southernmost counties are genetically closer to the HapMap CEU samples of northern European ancestry than to the populations of Sweden's northernmost counties. In other words, southern Swedes are genetically closer to other northern Europeans, including Danes and Germans, than they are to northern Swedes. The genetic divide in Sweden runs roughly along the line of historical provinces, with Dalarna County showing particularly interesting patterns. The study found that the population of Dalarna County in north-middle Sweden, which borders southern Norway, also appears to differ markedly from other counties, possibly due to this county having more individuals with remote Finnish or Norwegian ancestry than other counties. Northern Sweden shows significant admixture with Sami populations indigenous to northern Scandinavia and Finnish populations from across the Gulf of Bothnia. The research noted that the haplogroup frequencies of the counties closest to Finland, Norway, Denmark, and the Sami region in the north, exhibited similarities to the neighbouring populations, resulting from the formation of the Swedish nation during the past millennium. Finland was ruled by Sweden for over 600 years, from 1150 to 1809, and this left genetic traces. Many Swedes, especially in northern and eastern regions, have Finnish ancestry. The Humphreys study had to actively exclude samples with known Finnish grandparental ancestry because it is likely that the magnitude of stratification due to Finnish ancestry would overshadow any other subtle population structure patterns within Sweden. This Finnish component is virtually absent in Denmark due to geography and lack of direct contact. According to the Swedish DNA project and the 2006 study by Carlson and colleagues on Y chromosome diversity in Sweden, Swedish males carry I1, 35 to 40%, highest in southern and central Sweden, R1b, approximately 20 to 25%, R1a, approximately 15 to 20%, I2a, approximately 10 to 15%, N, 5 to 7%, higher in northern Sweden, of Finnish origin. The presence of haplogroup N in northern Sweden, virtually absent in Denmark, is a key differentiator, as N is characteristic of Finnish and other Uralic populations. The southern Swedish provinces of Skåne, Halland and Blekinge were historically Danish territories until 1658. These regions show genetic similarities to Denmark. The genetic data suggests that southern Swedes cluster with Danes and northern Germans, forming a distinct genetic region separate from central and northern Sweden. Now that we understand both populations, let's directly compare the key genetic differences. Difference number 1. Homogeneity versus diversity. Denmark. Remarkably homogeneous. Danes from Jutland are genetically very similar to Danes from Zealand. Sweden. Highly heterogeneous. Northern Swedes differ significantly from southern Swedes. More than southern Swedes differ from Danes. This difference likely reflects Denmark's smaller size and better internal connectivity, Sweden's elongated geography stretching from southern temperate zones to Arctic regions, and different patterns of regional isolation. Difference number 2. The Western Atlantic connection. Denmark. When analysed with principal component analysis, Danish genomes show clustering patterns that overlap more with Atlantic/Western European populations, including British samples, than pure Scandinavian populations. This reflects Denmark's position as a geographic crossroads, receiving ancient migrations from multiple directions. Sweden shows clearer north-south Scandinavian clustering in genetic studies. Southern Sweden clusters with other Scandinavians and northern Germans, while northern Sweden shows distinct patterns. This reflects Denmark's peninsular position as the gateway between continental Europe and Scandinavia, with complex ancient migration patterns from the Atlantic coast, Central Europe, and Scandinavia itself. Difference number 3. The Finnish/Eastern influence. Denmark. Virtually no Finnish genetic influence due to geographic separation. Sweden. Significant Finnish component in northern and eastern regions, with haplogroup N present at 5 to 7% nationally and higher in the north. This reflects Sweden's long border with Finland and centuries of Swedish rule over Finnish territories. Difference number 4. Regional structure. Denmark. 6 regions analysed by Athanasiadis showed only subtle differences, all within a tight genetic cluster. Sweden. Clear north-south genetic gradient, with Dalarna representing a transition zone. Counties close to borders show genetic influence from neighbouring populations. Difference number 5. Sami admixture. Denmark. No Sami genetic contribution. Sami never inhabited Denmark. Sweden. Northern counties show varying levels of Sami admixture, particularly in Lapland and northern inland regions. The Sami represent descendants of original Mesolithic hunter-gatherers with minimal Bronze Age admixture, making them genetically distinct from other Scandinavians. Difference number 6. German influence. Both countries show surprisingly low German genetic contribution despite proximity. Denmark. Only 3 to 7% German component, despite shared border. Sweden. Southern regions show some northern German influence, but less than expected. This suggests strong cultural boundaries maintain genetic distinctiveness. even when political borders were fluid. Similarity: the Bronze Age core. Despite these differences, both populations shared dominant corded ware/Yamnaya Bronze Age ancestry, approximately 70 to 75%, high I1 haplogroup frequencies, approximately 35 to 40%, very high lactose tolerance, over 95%, light pigmentation genes at high frequency, similar admixture patterns from Neolithic farmers and Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. Why did these differences develop between such close neighbours? Denmark is a small, compact country with good internal connectivity via sea routes. This facilitated gene flow between regions, creating homogeneity. Sweden is elongated, stretching over 1,500 kilometres from north to south. Northern regions were historically isolated, allowing distinct genetic patterns to develop and persist. Denmark, Sweden, and Norway were united under the Kalmar Union from 1397 to 1523. However, this political unity didn't erase genetic differences that had already developed over centuries of separate evolution. After Sweden broke away in 1523, the two nations often found themselves at war, reducing gene flow between them. Between 1563 and 1814, Denmark and Sweden fought numerous wars. These conflicts reduced migration between the countries, created strong national identities, and reinforced cultural and genetic boundaries. The Treaty of Roskilde in 1658 transferred Skåne, Halland, and Blekinge from Denmark to Sweden. These provinces retain genetic similarities to Denmark even today, over 350 years later. Sweden's 600-plus year rule over Finland, from 1150 to 1809, created opportunities for gene flow that Denmark never experienced. Swedish settlers in Finland and Finnish migration to Sweden created genetic links absent in Denmark. Both countries experienced population bottlenecks from the Black Death in 1347 to 1353, the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, and various famines and epidemics. But these affected the countries differently. Denmark's smaller, more connected population homogenized more rapidly after bottlenecks, while Sweden's regional isolation preserved local genetic patterns. The studies analyzed people with deep ancestral roots in each country. Modern immigration has added diversity to both nations, but the traditional genetic patterns remain visible in those with long-standing ancestry. So what does this genetic comparison tell us about Swedish and Danish identity? The biggest lesson: geographic proximity doesn't guarantee genetic similarity. Despite sharing a border region and centuries of shared history, Swedes and Danes have developed distinct genetic profiles. Cultural boundaries, historical conflicts, and geography all played roles in maintaining genetic distinctiveness. Sweden's genetic diversity suggests that Swedish identity may encompass multiple distinct regional populations with different ancestries. A person from Norrland and a person from Skåne may be more genetically different from each other than a person from Skåne is from a Dane. Denmark's homogeneity suggests a more unified genetic identity, though this developed over centuries of internal mixing. The Viking legacy. Both nations carried the Viking genetic legacy, but expressed it through different expansion patterns. Denmark's westward Viking expansion created genetic links with Atlantic/Western European populations through ancient shared ancestry patterns. Sweden's eastern expansion connected it to Finnish and Baltic populations through more recent admixture. These genetic differences have implications for medical genetics and disease susceptibility, personalized medicine. Different populations may respond differently to treatments. DNA tests can distinguish Swedes from Danes fairly accurately, and understanding migration patterns and history. The Swedish-Danish genetic comparison reminds us that national boundaries don't equal genetic boundaries. History, geography, and culture shape genetics over millennia. Even closely related populations can develop distinct genetic signatures. Scandinavian is not a single genetic entity, but a diverse collection of related populations. Sweden and Denmark, neighbours, rivals, cousins. They share a Bronze Age foundation, Viking heritage, and North Germanic languages. But DNA reveals they're more different than their proximity suggests. Denmark stands as one of Europe's most genetically homogeneous nations, with a unique mixture reflecting its position as a prehistoric crossroads between Atlantic Europe, continental Europe, and Scandinavia. Sweden stretches across a genetic gradient, from southern provinces that cluster with Danes and Germans to northern regions blending with Finns and Sami. The narrow waters between them represent not just a geographic divide, but a genetic one, carved by centuries of separate histories, different migration patterns, and the simple truth that culture and geography together determine where genes flow. From Bronze Age herders to Viking raiders to modern Scandinavians, the story written in Swedish and Danish DNA is one of shared origins and divergent destinies. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more.